Happy Friday, everybody. Um, we're going to spend a few minutes here together today to go back into what some of the work was about yesterday, specifically Desert Storm, mostly to understand what the circumstances were leading into it, but actually, probably more importantly, what the circumstances were coming out of the war. So, I know you just spent a little time working this week on geography. So, our focus is going to be what is taking place generally in the Middle East, but really in this area involving Iraq, Kuwait, and the border of Saudi Arabia. So, first of all, we're talking about what is taking place in late 1990, 1991. That's Storm, that's what they're talking about, but was not initially called Desert Storm, and we'll get to that. So, this all begins in 1990 when Iraq shocks the world and invades its much smaller neighbor to its southeast in Kuwait. In some way, it was surprising, but also for people who were paying attention, not entirely surprising. For the previous few months, Saddam Hussein had been doing some saber rattling. Saddam Hussein, again, is the president of Iraq. He'd been building up forces near the Kuwaiti border. However, most people didn't believe that he was actually going to invade, but rather that this was an attempt to gain concessions from Kuwait on some of their oil rights in the region. For some people, the way that this began reminded them of the Korean War. If you recall, during the Korean War, an unintentional statement by a U.S. official, if you recall, seemingly helped to trigger the start of the war. During the Korean War, this official suggested that Korea was outside of the United States defense perimeter, and a similar thing happened here when April Glaspie, a member of the U.S. State Department, said that the United States had no strategic alliance with Kuwait, which, while technically true, seemed to give Saddam Hussein the green light to invade, believing that the United States would not take action. Turns out he was very wrong on that. So when Iraq invaded Kuwait and quickly seized authority over it, the United States immediately began sending troops into Saudi Arabia. Thinking back, the United States had a long relationship with Saudi Arabia going back to 1945, primarily on the basis of them exporting massive amounts of oil to the United States and to our partners throughout the West. So initially, Desert Storm was not Desert Storm, it was Desert Shield. The intent was to ensure that Saddam Hussein and Iraq were not going to continue their invasion into Saudi Arabia. And so for several months, Desert Storm was simply Desert Shield, trying to protect our ally in Saudi Arabia. Now, over the next several months, an international discussion was taking place about what to do about this. And 1991 holds, at least for now, a pretty important place in kind of world diplomatic history. This was the year when the Soviet Union collapsed, the Cold War was over, the United States had emerged victorious, and along with that, the idea was that it wasn't just the United States, but it was our democratic system, it was our economic system, it was the right of nations not to be invaded by their neighbors. So the United Nations Security Council authorized an official military intervention with the goal of removing the Iraqi military from Kuwait. A couple of significant things about this. The goal here again is simply to remove the Iraqi military from Kuwait. It is not to remove Saddam Hussein from power. It is not to invade Iraq. So there were very clear guidelines. The other notable thing about this is nearly every country in the world took a part in this. In the invasion, in the buildup to the invasion, pretty much all of the Arab countries that the United States had been trying to gain support from throughout the Cold War supported action to get Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait. One of the few countries actually who was not involved in this was Israel. But this was in large part because the United States had to work hard to keep Israel from supporting it. Their fear was that if Israel was part of this coalition to go after or to remove Iraq from Kuwait, then all of the other Arab states like Jordan and Syria, that they would not support it. So again, here we see the United States kind of competing policy priorities coming into play here. We wanted to support Israel, but we also wanted to gain support from the Arab states. The United States was able to kind of keep Israel from officially being part of this coalition, but there were over 100 other countries that actively participated. The actual air war begins, the Desert Storm part of the operation, in early 1991. And initially, we were preparing for a ground invasion. We were attempting to weaken Iraqi air defenses. And at the same time, we were targeting Saddam Hussein. That never came to fruition, but that was part of the goal. Now, while this is going on, Iraq takes a different tack. And they begin launching missiles against Israel, who is not even part of the coalition. Again, Iraq was clearly attempting to drive a wedge between this coalition. They knew that if Israel, or they believed that if Israel would have responded back against them, then the Arab states would likely have withdrawn their support from the coalition. The United States worked very hard to keep Israel from openly retaliating back against Iraq. They were able to, but again, this emphasizes how intensely our policy ideals were competing with each other. After several weeks of bombing, the ground war begins with a mass force of 700,000 troops to remove the Iraqi military from the fairly small territory of Kuwait. And this aspect of the war ends in very short order. In fact, in some places you will see this referred to as the 100 Hours War. It takes better part of 4 days, and after 4 days, the Iraqi military is removed from Kuwait. The U.S. forces briefly go into Iraq, largely pushing them back farther and farther from the border. But ultimately, the decision is made that this was not the goal of the war. This was not what the Security Council authorized. So U.S. forces and coalition forces left Iraq with March 8th. Saddam Hussein remained in power. You see a link at the bottom of the screen there. If you want, you can go, and I've posted this link in Google Classroom. If you want to go watch it now, it might make sense. Otherwise, I'll have you take a look afterwards. So Iraq is removed from power. Iraq is removed from Kuwait. Saddam Hussein remains in power. So what exactly happens then? Well, first of all, the United Nations placed economic sanctions on Iraq. They wanted to penalize them, and specifically they wanted to try to prevent a rebuilding of the Iraqi forces, many of which had been decimated in the air campaign beginning in January and in the 4 days of actual fighting. So there were economic penalties placed on Iraq, again, targeting their military. Secondly, during this time, the United States encouraged the minority groups within Iraq. Again, Iraq was divided between Sunni Muslims, Shia Muslims, the Kurds. This was a byproduct of the Sykes-Picot Agreement that really didn't pay attention to where people lived. Again, lines were simply drawn on the map. We encouraged these uprisings, but Saddam Hussein crushed these uprisings. This was part of why the war ended so quickly, because Saddam Hussein understood that he needed to reserve part of his forces for these uprisings that he believed would likely happen. Some of these attacks were done using chemical weapons. This will become part of the discussion and debate about the invasion of Iraq in 2003. As part of this, the United States forces remained in Saudi Arabia. We built several military bases, which are still standing today. And the intent, at least the stated intent, was that we wanted that to be a deterrent to Saddam Hussein attempting anything like this in the future. As part of the ceasefire agreement, Iraq was required to commit itself to having regular inspections by the United Nations to ensure that their weapon systems were within international law, and specifically that they were not developing nuclear or chemical weapons. The UNSCOM there, that is the organization that is was placed in charge of these inspections. And I bring them up because, again, they're going to be part of the story as we get into 2003. Between 1991 and 1998, a recurring story in the news was that at different times, Saddam Hussein and Iraq would not allow UNSCOM to fully conduct their weapons inspections. So this happened repeatedly, and repeatedly These denials were typically met with some degree of U.S. force being applied. Missile attacks against specific sites, but typically in a fairly limited manner. But in December of 1998, the United States launched what was called Operation Desert Fox. After Saddam Hussein actually expelled weapons inspectors from Iraq, the United States responded by massive airstrikes at different Iraqi command centers, at different suspected weapon sites. So, Desert Storm ended. Saddam Hussein is in power. The United States military didn't really leave Saudi Arabia. The United States did not cease using force against Iraq. We repeatedly used it against them in response to specific violations. What you're going to be reading now is a statement from Osama bin Laden, who in 1998, he and his organization Al-Qaeda essentially declare war against the United States. When you read his statement, what I'm going to be asking you to look for, and this is stated in Google Classroom, is what particular historical events, developments does Osama bin Laden draw upon as justification for a war against the United States?